like to introduce Dr. Bryce Walker, who is an assistant professor of classics here at Sweet Briar. Professor Walker received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's taught at Bryn Mawr, Washington and Lee, and Colgate University. Dr. Walker is currently the forerunner for the new Honors Colloquium Award for Best and Longest Honors Colloquium title. Today you will present Aliens Among Us, the Devolution of Roman Satire, Tales of Tolerance Tested and Ethics Emerging, or Trapped in a Closet, Does Tom Cruise Really Have All the Answers? Talk of sausages, handbooks, hip-hop error, and healthcare.
We got the sausages covered, I guess. I think hopefully by the end you'll realize the reason for the extended title, and maybe what Tom Cruise might have to do with this. So let's get started. Aliens Among Us, the Devolution of Roman Satire. Tales of Tolerance Tested and Ethics Emerging, in which I have combined 4 years of honors themes in one talk. Which doesn't mean that I will not give a talk next year, but the reason for this might become apparent shortly. Talk of sausages, handbooks. It's actually hip-hopera, not the hip-hop era. There's a difference, and we'll talk about that in healthcare.
I thought the same thing.
It's true, it's true. I received an email from Eric. All right, so let's talk about what I want the focus to be today, which is basically my interest in satire, which has to do with this idea of consumption. What happens when we consume satire in various forms? What happens to us? What happens to our minds? What happens to our bodies? How does it affect us? And what do we do with it? Both literally and metaphorically. And there's another use of consumption that might come in handy, which is an old name for TV, where medical imagery comes into play often in Roman satire and other forms of satiric discourse. And we have here a short quote from Persius' third satire, the first of the death in the bath scenes in Roman satire. Stuff from his feast, this one goes to bathe, his belly white, his throat emitting long, sulphurous stenches, but as he drinks, a fit of shivers come over him and knocks the hot glass out of his hands, his bare teeth chatter, then the lavish flavorings slide from his slapped lips. Not a pleasant scene at all. Now, one distinction I want to make clear at the very beginning is the difference between Roman satire and what I want to call the satiric mode or the satiric attitude. Now, Roman satire is a specified genre, and it has its own formal rules that go with us. This is probably the most famous quote about Roman satire. You will not open a book on Roman satire without seeing this somewhere. It's from Quintilian, as he's comparing various genres, most of which the Romans stole from the Greeks. But satire, he says, is completely ours. So where does this come from, if it is completely ours? Well, there's a lot of theories. I'm going to go through them one by one. And these are all from a late grammarian from the 3rd or 4th century, this Diomedes is his name. And his first idea is that satire gets its name from satyrs, because in this kind of poetry, comical and shameless things are said, which are uttered and made by the satyrs. Right? Seems to make sense. There's a little problem with the vowel transferring over from Latin to Greek, and it doesn't seem to be the real reason for it, as Isaac Casaubon finally decided for us in 1604. Nevertheless, this idea of satire and the connection with satyrs is going to pop up from time to time, and the Romans are certainly very much aware of it. But we can move on to the second reason. Or from a full dish, a long satira, which is filled with many various kinds of first fruits and offered to the gods in a rite among primitive people, and is called satire from the amount and fullness of the stuff. But what better image for a religious offering in the South than a piled plate of barbecue? So that's another reason. Or from a certain kind of sausage, which was filled with many things, and Varro says was called satire. So we have these competing ideas. We have sausage, we have a full plate, we have satyrs, and then we get one more that gets thrown in the mix. and maybe recognize the 2012 federal budget. Others say it was called Satire from a compendious law which draws together in one motion many things at the same time on the argument that in satiric poems many poems are combined together at the same time. So we have these competing definitions or etymologies, and the Romans are very much aware of it and very much using it as imagery in their satires. Especially this notion of what is enough, what is too much. Now, who exactly are we talking about? The Roman satirists are four, three of whom we have actual full satires. So this first, Gaius Lucilius. We have fragments that are mainly collected because they are grammatically odd or use funny words. So we don't really get that great a sense of what Lucilius is up to. Now, hip-hop is going to get thrown in from time to time in this talk. When I'm trying to think about Lucilius, I think of him as an OG, like an original gangster. That's kind of how other satirists refer to him or think of him. They don't refer to him that way, but they think of him that way. Then we have Horace, who I like to think of as the upstart. Right? He's up and coming under the age of Augustus and late in the 1st century BC. We have Persius, the most difficult of the satirists, and someone who we like to call the recluse. And then finally, Juvenal, the angry man, early in the 2nd century CE. So we have about a 400-year time span that we're dealing with, okay, 300-plus year time span. Now, can we look at these people and try to figure out what they are thinking of when they think about satire? What are they conceiving of satire as being? Well, originally, satire, or how the later satirists conceive of Lucilius, is a sort of figure in the old republic, right? Somebody who could say what he wanted and do what he wanted. Somebody who actually had access to this thing called libertas, or free speech. Right? Sort of a cowboy out in the Wild West, actually fighting battles. Right? And we get some fragments of Lucilius to see what kind of language used. And I just want to say from the outset, some of the material in this talk is for mature audiences only. But this gives a pretty good range of what we think Lucilius is up to. Right? She'll jerk, and this is from the OLD, move the haunches as in coitus, as though she were winnowing corn with her buttocks. Down and double nap coverlets, or whatever luxury it is. So we have sort of sexual deviancy, we have luxury, and then we have this idea of free speech. And you split me by libeling me in many a discourse. And this word sermonibus is also one that Horace will use as an actual name for his satires too. So maybe this one is talking about Lucilius himself. You know. But it seems that Lucilius has this reputation of being dangerous, right? Somebody who can get the job done. And the other satirists all talk about Lucilius. Right? So this is Horace in the opening of his fourth satire. He talks about the old comedians and what they did when they were censuring vice. And then that Lucilius completely depends on them. And what do we know about Lucilius? Well, he's witty. He's of a well-wiped nose. Nose is figured prominently in Horace and Persius, and I have no idea why. But a bit harsh in composing his poems. So Lucilius is out there on the front lines, but, you know, Horace could probably make things run a little smoother. This very telling line from Persius. Lucilius cut into the city, and these two people that he was known to attack, Lupus and Mucius, and broke a molar on them. And then Juvenal. Whenever Lucilius blazes and roars as if with a drawn sword, the hero whose mind is chilled with crime grows red, and his heartstrings sweat with silent guilt. Then come rage and tears. So Lucilius can actually cause this kind of emotive response. Now, what's interesting is that we have passages surrounding this Juvenalian passage which are a little more telling. John Kay is the lead singer from Steppenwolf. So by the time Juvenal's around, this idea that you can just go out and abuse people and right wrongs no longer exists. Right? So you, the poisoner, you can't go and talk against the poisoner. You're going to get in trouble. So what does Juvenal say? get this last line, then I'll see what I can get away with against the people whose ashes are covered by the Flaminian and Latin roads. I'm only going to talk about dead people. That's how I'm going to stay safe. That's what Juvenal says. I'm no Lucilius in that respect. What about Perseus? Well, am I forbidden to mutter, not even in secret, right? Perseus has this joke, and the joke is that everybody in Rome has ass's ears. But he can't say it. Right? So he digs a little hole for his libellus, his little book. And then Horace, at the beginning of his second book of satire, so he publishes the first book. The second book, maybe there's some repercussions from that first book. And so it opens with some people saying that his satire is too strong, other people saying it's too weak. But there are legal issues involved. There are legal issues involved. That it's dangerous. What can we do? Now, I think a good way, at least one of the ways that I like to think through this, since we don't have a lot of knowledge about the cultural circumstances of Horace, was he really in trouble? Who knows? But we do know some things about these guys. And so I have 3 clips that I want to play briefly, and hopefully the internet will cooperate with me. But we may have to sit through an ad, unfortunately. And these are all from, or these 2 clips are from an episode in season 9 called Trapped in the Closet. I believe we are. Oh, wow. We're going to need some sound.
Breaking news here in South Park. Tom Cruise and John Travolta.
This is something. Right, so in the first clip, Tom Cruise has trapped himself in this closet, locked himself in the closet. There's a lot of issues about Scientology involved. And so they have R. Kelly go up. Because R. Kelly, it turns out, has just released a DVD a little bit before this comes out, called Trapped in the Closet, which is a series of vignettes, which he calls hip-hopper, which is sort of this extended opera that involves him waking up being in a strange person's bed and having to hide in a closet. And R. Kelly can't get him out of the closet, but eventually R. Kelly goes in the closet. And so the second clip involves them finally coming out, and I believe it's Stan, who has been anointed the next L. Ron Hubbard, right? And there's a bunch of Scientologists who are waiting for him to come out and give his pronouncements. And he eventually decides that he's not going to do that. And it ends with the Scientologists all saying that they're going to sue him, right? And Tom Cruise then comes out of the house and says that he's going to sue them too, right? And so what is set up in the satire is this extended threat of legal repercussions for what they have to say. Now, it turns out that, if I remember which one's Trey and which one's Matt. I think it's Matt Stone and Trey Parker. If we have time at the end, right, maybe we can go back and revisit that. So that they were on an episode of Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and she talks about this very issue, right? And so she asked if they were actually sued by the Scientologists. And I think their answer is very telling, right? They think it's cool that they worked closely with the lawyers at Viacom to make sure that they went up to the very edge of what would be suable by the Scientologists, but did not go any further, right? And you get this end part, right? That you can't say pyramid scheme, right? And they call it a scheme, they call it a bunch of other stuff. They do not call it a pyramid scheme, right? And then they're sort of playing with the radio appearance here, right? They wouldn't let us say that Scientology is a pyramid scheme. Now we're not saying that. Right now on the radio, they wouldn't let us. So what you need to bring to bear to the episode is that Scientology has this litigious personality that goes along with it, right? And they also say things about Tom Cruise, right? And the question is that at this point there's this rumor circulating that Tom Cruise is really gay. So, did they have any problem with that? And no, they don't, because it's satire and they're legally protected. And then we like putting true rumors in all the time. Right? And they have a name, and they call them Trumers, right? But I think the second part about the joke is really interesting, right? I mean, that joke was more like, he was a bad joke because you can just, like, it's okay, but you're saying he's gay. It's very sort of disjunctive discourse here. It's like, no, we're just saying that he's in the closet. Right? You know, you're playing on that rumor, but you're really just playing a bad joke over and over again and getting mileage out of it. Right? So think about how this works, right? That unless you know that the rumor's already out there, right, the joke doesn't really work. Unless you know that Scientology is already litigious, the Scientology stuff doesn't work, right? So the satire works on your preconceived notions of what these people are up to or what's being said about them, right? So keep that in mind as we move forward. All right, so if we can kind of think back through the satirists and how they present themselves, right? Because there's a distinction here between how they present themselves and what they seem to be actually doing, right? So constructing satire, it's a simple compulsion in response to events in the real world, right? I can't help but renounce vice when it shows up in the real world. Well, in fact, right, there's a whole lot of motivations that go into the creation of satire. And it's a detailed construction that happens over a period of time. I think a very interesting thing about South Park is, and it came out of this interview as well, is that they don't finish their shows until right at the last moment, which is how some of this Tom Cruise stuff slipped through. They formally mediate their satire all the way up until the last minute. But where those cracks appear, it's because there wasn't any time left. Right? Not because they made a mistake or were purposely going farther than they should. Another conceit is that producing satire is an immediate response. Right? But there's all this evidence of formal mediation in all kinds of satiric discourse. Now there's this driving necessity to expose vices. But the success of the satire depends on your knowledge of those vices already. Adopting the stance of the simple man, or a stance of objection. And here we have a quote from Perseus. Do you want to hear something aliquid decoctius, a little more cooked down, right? So it's not so much that it's just, oh, I'm just a guy on the street writing about what I see and all the rich people that pass me by, which is what Juvenal says that he's doing. But in fact, what we're doing is we're taking a whole bunch of different genres, a whole bunch of different kinds of discourse, and we're distilling it into satire. And then the final thing is this fear of repercussions. But, right, if we look at a lot of different examples, there's knowledge of those repercussions, and you're going right up to the edge of those repercussions, and you're skirting those repercussions. Right? So, what satire seems to be doing isn't necessarily what it actually is doing, which brings up the question of what actually is it doing. Okay. So this brings up a second major point about satire, which is edification. Plain and praise, not a typo. And so here I think is a very illuminating quote from Dustin Griffin, who wrote this book, Satire, Critical Reconstruction. Right, so if we want to start thinking about what the traditional interpretation of satire is, it's bipolar praise and blame pattern. There's a thematic center of some moral standard. The satirist appeals to this moral standard and confirms attitudes that we all share, right? So we're all in the same boat. And a lot of these are traditionally sanctioned values. Satire is, according to a traditional interpretation, a conservative genre. And that the satirist works like a preacher or rhetorician to persuade his audience to virtue. We're going to figure out what the vices are, and then we're going to get us on the right path, even though we all kind of agree on a certain conglomeration. But if we go back about 1,000 years or so, right? And we start looking at the reception of satire in the Middle Ages. Some very interesting things pop out, and perhaps, or I would say, contributed to the development of that traditional view. So if we look at a 12th century advice on the reading list, the first thing on that reading list is the distichs of Cato, these kind of moralizing proverbs that are attributed to Cato the Elder. And then the Eclogue of Theodulus, which is this medieval work that I'm not familiar with. And then the Eclogues and Bucolics of Virgil. That all seems nice. But then you read the satirists and the historians, right? So that he may learn about the vices to avoid in the age of minority. And this is basically taken straight from Horace 1:4, where he talks about what his father instills in him. And let him look for the noble deeds of those who ought to be imitated. And that seems to come straight from Livy in this kind of moralizing history. But then later on, let him reserve the moral sayings of Juvenal in the secrecy of his breast and study hard how to avoid the shamefacedness of nature. Right? So the satirists can actually teach us how to be better people. Now, how do they do this? One wonders. Right? This idea of naked satire, or something that is hermeneutically transparent. So in introductions to Horace and Juvenal in the Middle Ages, we find some interesting quotes. And the first is about the differences between Horace's epistles and his satires. Now the epistles and the satires are written in the same meter, so they fulfill the same formal metrical requirements. So in that way they are identical. But their content seems to be remarkably different according to this medieval introduction. The epistles with beautiful and honest expressions, pulchris et honestis verbis, that is it, spur us on to the virtues, while the satires with naked, nudis, and uncovered apertis expressions prune our vices. So that's what satire can do for us. And now we can go back again to that early etymology that Casaubon eventually discards in the 17th century, right? It is possible that satire comes from satyrs. Satire is naked like they are, and without covering condemns the vices of the Romans, right? Satire is easy to interpret because it's just right out there for you. But we've just been talking about how it just seems to be right out there for you, and it's actually not right out there for you. And then in an introduction to Horace's Satire 2:6, the famous city mouse and country mouse satire, we get this. The intention of Horace in this satire is to condemn the city life because the many improprieties which exist there, and by praising, to recommend the country life. So, city, evil, dirty, crowded, bad. Country life, simple, rustic. Oh, we already read, Virgil's Bucolics on our reading list, so the idealized country life seems very welcoming. So, if, as I would argue, satire is more complicated than just the simple idea of praise and blame, is it good for anything, and what is it good for? Do satirists have responsibilities? What are those responsibilities? How should we interpret them? That's where it brings themselves this man. So, if you talk about satire with anybody in a contemporary setting, Jon Stewart gets brought up in approximately 1.5 seconds. Now, it's very difficult to tell exactly what he's doing, and it's worth thinking through how his show operates and how he operates. So we have a few quotes here that we can look to. In 2002, right, he had an interview where he talks about the interview segment of The Daily Show. Honestly, one of the reasons that it's there is just that we can't write that much. It's not part of the show that any of us necessarily go, I can't wait to get hold of that interview segment and make it happen, right? So, if you're unaware of the format of The Daily Show, it essentially splits into two parts. The first is essentially a series of satirical vignettes, and then there's an introduction of a guest that does a sort of interview one-on-one with Jon Stewart. Now, it's also interesting to note that in the early days of the show, in the first few years of the show, that interview guest was mainly from the world of entertainment. You would go in to shill your movie or TV show. Sometimes, in the case of Dennis Leary, you're just a friend of Jon Stewart's, and they have a sort of conversation that's a sort of inside conversation, which is a whole other thing that I think is fascinating. Eventually, this starts to take a more political turn. Right, that the guests that come on the show become more and more political. Jon Stewart seems to evolve into much more of a political animal. And so another thing that seems to happen is the show bifurcates, whereas the first part of the show now seems to be satirical, and the second part of the show seems to be informative in some sense, right? Serious discourse about politics or culture. Now, one of the issues is, can people necessarily separate those two things, or do they view it all as a kind of satirical blob, right? That the Daily Show is satirical, and if it's bookended on the other side by the Colbert Report, it's very easy to get lost in that middle ground, right, and assume that that's being satirical. This issue comes to a head, and this is what I think is a sort of fascinating event from the last year, is his role in granting health benefits for the 9/11 first responders. There's a very famous episode, I believe aired on December 16th or 17th, in which he had some first responders on the show. The interview segment was approximately 10 minutes long or so, and the show itself had a dominantly serious tone. And then the day after Christmas, it turns out, there was an article in the New York Times about equating Jon Stewart to Edward R. Murrow, right? Which I think was got emailed around a lot. It was a pretty interesting article. And in addition, we can see this quote by Brian Williams, who shows up on the show a lot. It seems to be a friend of Jon Stewart's, right? That he seems to be able to separate this out. Jon gets to decide the rules governing his own activism and the causes he supports, right? So now we have a satirist that's acting as an activist, but can they act as a satirical activist? Is that even possible, right? In medieval times, it seems to be eminently possible. And how often he does it, and his audiences get to decide whether, if they like serious Jon as much as they do satirical Jon, right? So we now have a sort of bifurcated personality. Maybe that's responsible for that expression in that picture. And there are a lot of responses or reactions to this, right? Which I think are incredibly interesting. So, what's going on, right? Some people say it's the Times, right? A lot of young people find news shows boring and get their info from a show such as Stewart's. And here's an interesting aspect of that response, right? That are people actually getting their information from the Daily Show? Or is it similar to that idea that we talked about in the South Park episode, where you need to bring that information to the show, right? Some will say it's due to his talent, and some will argue it is also due to the battered mainstream media losing credibility. Right, so the Daily Show has kind of inserted itself within another genre. And one way to look at satire as a mode is that it's parasitic. That it essentially sits upon and eats up other generic forms, right? And to a certain extent, disables those generic forms. Another critic has a very good point, that Jon Stewart doesn't let his staff talk about this episode, right? Somehow he has boxed this off as something separate. Heroic social crusaders are just less funny. I mean, how many times did you laugh at good night and good luck, right? Which I think is a very good point. Now we can also think back to the rally to restore sanity and or fear in Washington, right? That drew an enormous number of people. And the rally itself emphasized such less than impassioned virtues as open-minded debate and moderation. Right? So now we can think of, let's think of satire in its role as building up our virtuous selves. Right? if its role at castigating vice was to tell us that vices that we already knew were out there aren't good for us, its role in spurring us on to virtue are telling us that things like moderation and open-minded debate are good things, right? And we have a quote here from Juvenal, abstineas igitur damnandis, you should refrain from doing bad things, right? Which ends up being a very quoted line of Juvenal's in the Middle Ages. Right? Juvenal says, don't do bad things. How much depth is there? And if there's not depth there, right, which I think we can agree that there's not, what is it doing? What is it accomplishing that's something different? Here's a quote from Etymology, in a sort of self-reflective track, right, where he kind of goes through the history of hip-hop and imagines what would happen if people actually did the actions that are in the song, right? I think another line, Ludacris said, throw them bows, now I'm in a hospital, with something in a fractured elbow, right? So the idea is that if you pay attention to this and take it literally, right, you can get yourself in trouble. That there's this distinction between what happens in art and what happens in reality, even if art is pretending to be reality. Right? Even if satire says, I'm just looking out at the real world, what it's really saying is, I'm absorbing the real world, altering it, and changing it into something, right? And what that something is ends up being this sort of combination of all this different stuff. So you have your full plate and your stuffed sausage that's full of all kinds of actions and genres and other elements. Which is not to say that there aren't real world consequences. And this is a very famous episode from Suetonius' Life of Julius Caesar about the poet Catullus, who wrote some very nasty things, which he doesn't quote here, and I'm not quoting, but trust me, they are. Valerius Catullus had also libeled him in his verses about Memora, yet Caesar, while admitting that these were a permanent blot on his name, right? There's a permanent stain attached to Caesar, no pun intended, because of these poems of Catullus, he accepted Catullus' apology and invited him to dinner that same day, and never interrupted his friendship with Catullus' father, whom he knew as being a public official in the northern part of Italy. Now, here's, I think, an interesting question. And Catullus does not define himself as a Roman satirist per se, but he does write poetry that shares many points of contact with Roman satire. And what I think is an interesting question to think through here is, did Catullus know that he was going to be forgiven because of Caesar's well-known generous nature, and felt that he then could push things as far as he did? Or is he just lucky, right, that he pushed things only as far as he did and Caesar still forgave him? Right? This is that ground that satirists operate in. And how much they know they're pushing those limits and how much they're not eventually becomes, I think, part of the draw of satire. So, what I'd like to do is offer some tentative conclusions, and then maybe we can go back, since we have some time, and load up those videos, and maybe we can see what we're talking about and take some questions. And so as I think through these issues, this is what I think emerges. When satirists are effective, meaning when they cause change in the real world, when they can actually act as change agents, it is either as non-satirists, right? So this is that role of Jon Stewart. As a non-satirist, as a political activist, right, using his prestige as a satirist, he can get, or at least contribute to actual political change. Or when their satire has been sufficiently decontextualized. So if we look at what are called the medieval libri manuales, these handbooks of quotations, where do you see the satirists show up? They show up with people like Seneca, Boethius, right? Other known philosophical figures. Juvenal and Horace too both get the epithet ethnicus or ethicus in the Middle Ages by John of Salzburg and somebody else whose name escapes me right now. But that it takes removing them from their context for that to happen. Right? In the same way that if you're a medieval reader, you can read through a satire looking for points of contact with Christian theology. Right? Looking for, and you can, if you look at the glosses on some of these medieval texts, they're looking for proverbial expressions that they can map up with their own beliefs. Right? So then they can be effective. Satire can be dangerous, but it's dangerous when these markers of formal mediation or appreciation of those markers break down. Right? That the only time satire is actually dangerous is when somebody's not getting it. Right? Whether the satirist is not getting it or the audience is not getting it. That satire entails an appreciation of multiple perspectives on the part of his satirist objects and his audience. Right? This goes back to that notion of satires having so many things thrown into it. Right? So many levels of meaning, so cooked down that there's a consistent shifting of perspective that happens in satire. And that this normative response, or this traditional response of satirist as attacker, right? Object sort of distance, and audience in line with the satirist against that target is not necessarily a stable arrangement. If you are a Scientologist watching the episode of South Park, which attacks Scientology, you probably have a distinctly different reaction. And then the last one, satire is an exercise in agony and failure. And agony in a traditional sense of competition. Right? It's an agon. Reading satire is a competitive act. There are winners, there are losers. And failure. Failure because as an audience, you're never going to actually identify sufficiently with the satirist that you're trying to identify with because his nature always shifts. And failure because you're not going to be able to do that, and the satirist is not going to be able to accomplish the things that he claims that he's going to accomplish. Sort of the question that I have is, if satire has all these characteristics, why is it so popular and why is it so fun? Right? If it's an exercise that's destined in failure, which I think it is, why is it so enjoyable? And those are questions that I urge you